Welcome, everybody. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Vili Lehdonvirta in our seminar. Vili is a professor of economic sociology and digital social research at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. Vili's research broadly studies how digital technologies are used to transform the way economic activities are organized in society, thereby taking into account the implications for workers, consumers, businesses, and states. Vili has published a lot of his research in prestigious journals, among others, the Journal of Management, Socioeconomic Review, or Sociology. And today he will talk about whether we are moving towards a borderless labor market. And without further ado, thank you once again for being here, Vili. We are so happy to have you, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you very much, Lars, and all the organizers for this pretty generous invitation. Very happy to be here virtually, if not in flesh. And obviously, the topic of my talk is very related to the fact that we are all working remotely and virtually now. It's a very prominent question today whether we are moving towards some kind of a borderless labor market, insofar as it seems that many jobs, at least white-collar jobs, can suddenly be performed remotely without regard to location. And that then gives rise to these questions of whether national institutions still play a part in regulating our labor markets and so on. And I'm going to address these questions today with essentially a history of what is today the biggest global online freelancing marketplace, Upwork. And I think the story of Upwork and the challenges and solutions that the founders came up with perhaps help us to think about also how labor markets may or may not be changing today in the wider world. So the story starts somewhat surprisingly, perhaps in Greece in the early 70s. So Greece in the early 70s was controlled by a military dictatorship, the regime of colonels, as it was known, which crushed the dissent with censorship, surveillance, beatings, and torture. The country was isolated from European affairs, and its entry into the European community, which is the precursor to the European Union, was blocked. But in 1973, students of one of the country's most prestigious universities, the National Technical University in Athens, went on strike. They occupied the university's main buildings and started chanting slogans against the regime. Thousands of people came out in their support. The crowd was jubilant, speeches were given. But the regime's forces quickly surrounded the dissidents. Snipers opened fire. Students barricaded themselves in and physically cut off from the outside world. They used laboratory equipment to cobble together a makeshift radio station. Over radio, they kept on chanting the revolutionary messages. Polytechnion here, people of Greece, the Polytechnion is the flag bearer of our common struggle against the dictatorship and for democracy. Now, the following night, the regime's forces put a violent end to these transmissions. A tank crashed through the students' barricades, but the message had already been received. It triggered a series of events that led to the dictatorship's fall. And the first free parliamentary elections since the dictatorship were held exactly a year later. Now, during these events, there was a boy named Odysseus Tsatalos, who was growing up in Athens. and he was interested in technology. He was particularly interested in information technology, which was a new study area that the National Technical University had introduced after the dictatorship's fall. Now, Odysseus's father thought that information technology was, quote, an end of the career before it even began. His father was a lawyer and wanted his son to become a doctor. But Odysseus's best friend, Stratis Karamanlakis, shared his interest in IT, and times were changing. Greece joined the European community, borders were opened, and funding for IT development was pouring in. In 1983, Tsatalos and Karamanlakis both took up studies in information technology at the famed Polytechnion, and in 1988, both men graduated. After graduation, their paths diverged. Karamanlakis started a career in Greece, whereas Tsatalos was admitted to a computer science graduate program in the United States. By 2001, Odysseus Tsatalos' journey to the United States had taken him to California. He was working as the chief technical officer of a startup company that he had co-founded called Intact Corporation. The company was based in San Jose, pictured here, the unofficial capital of the Silicon Valley. And it was building an accounting system for large enterprises. The system's special feature was that it could be accessed remotely over the internet using a web browser. So you didn't have to be physically present at the company's premises. But as migrants do, Tsatalos missed his native country. He probably missed the people that he had to leave behind to pursue this path. And one day, it seemed that this pain and nostalgia coincided with business requirements, because a need came up for Intact to hire a contractor with skills that matched those of his old best friend, Karamanlakis. Now, Karamanlakis had also become an experienced IT professional by this point, but he had built a life on the old continent and could not be convinced to uproot it and migrate 11,000 kilometers to San Jose. A work visa to the US was not necessarily easy to obtain either, because the numbers were capped. The two friends thought that they could nevertheless work together remotely over the internet. After all, the internet was supposed to be transcending national borders, according to many visionaries. It was providing the wiring necessary to bridge the gap, quote, between distant knowledge workers and employers, argued John Barlow. Others argued that all persons tapped into the global communications network have ties approximating those used in a given metropolitan region. And as a result, what once had to happen in the city can now take place anywhere. This was argued by Anthony Pascal already in 1987. So electronic communications were turning the entire world into a global village, as Marshall McLuhan argued. Even if some of these visions seemed a bit overblown, Tsatalos and Karamanlakis were both information technology professionals, and Intact was a software company whose main product was a remote access system. The inputs and outputs of Karamanlakis' work were lines of software code that could be easily transmitted over the internet. So if the internet was going to transcend borders anywhere, it seems that this was about the easiest scenario that could be imagined. Yet Intact's CEO rejected the idea. The reasons had nothing to do with internet speeds or how to transmit the code. The issue was managerial. A typical contractor at the time was someone who sat at the desk at the company's office, where others could collaborate with them and where they could be effectively monitored. How else would managers ensure that contractors spend their billable hours on what they were supposed to be spending them on? This is a picture of how the internet was visualized in the 90s and 80s when these cyber visionaries were painting pictures of a borderless world. The social scientists call this problem the principal agent problem, the problem of ensuring that an agent, in this case the contractor, truly works in the interest of the principal who hired them, in this case the company. The problem is exacerbated when the two parties are at a distance from each other. The principal cannot directly monitor the agent from a distance, and softer means such as building a shared sense of purpose are likewise harder to accomplish without close contact. So this principal agent problem helps to explain why, despite the internet's explosive growth, and despite these visions of work moving from physical offices into a spaceless city, and everyone just surfing around the globe like this, and despite these visions, nothing like this actually had been realized. In fact, the opposite had happened. People in search of jobs were flocking into actual cities like San Jose, like Berlin, like London, faster than ever before. They came from the countryside and from countries like Greece with fewer jobs. And many of the migrants were highly skilled, programmers, artists, writers. And they came because they had found little use for their skills in their native regions. But cities were getting congested. In many places, rents skyrocketed. And at the same time, remoter regions lost many of their brightest, and friends and families got separated. So the internet might have made it easy for files to cross vast distances in milliseconds, but monitoring and trusting still depended on proximity, with the result that getting hired remained almost infinitely easier in person. Distance imposed a tyranny which humans had yet not overcome. But Tsatalos and Karamanlakis, perhaps unaware of these daunting facts, set about cobbling together a software tool that would address their CEO's concerns. Intact was building a system for remote accounting management. Couldn't the same be done for contractor management? The more objections the CEO raised, the more features the friends added to their tool. The core of Tsatalos and Karamanlakis' tool was a remote monitoring system that made it possible for a manager to see a screenshot of what was happening on a remote contractor screen once every 10 minutes or so. The manager could also see a measure of the intensity of the contractor's keyboard and mouse use. Here's how that looks like. All the surveillance was meant to simulate the shared office environment in which the rest of the team worked, where a manager could take glances at a contractor's screens and hear their keyboards clicking. And this not only reassured managers that billable hours were spent productively, which was hardly an issue in this case because the friends trusted each other, but also reassured on-site workers that everyone was being subjected to the same level of scrutiny. And the motto was, how can we make remote work feel like, look like, be like local work, said Karamanlakis. By the time Tsatalos and Karamanlakis were finished, they had built this entire suite of remote collaboration and management tools. And it included features such as instant messaging an automatic time tracker, and tools for creating timesheets and sending invoices. And they called their system the Online Desk, or Odesk for short. Odesk solved the problem that the friends had set out to solve. It made it possible for Intact to hire Karamanlakis. But Tsatalos and Karamanlakis were no longer interested in working for Intact. They realized that other managers and contractors around the world could also benefit from Odesk, not because they were necessarily long separated friends, but because it would allow them to reap the benefits of migration without anyone actually moving. So in 2005, Tsatalos and Karamanlakis successfully raised venture capital for their startup, Odesk Incorporated. They rented an office in Redwood City, Silicon Valley. The funders complemented the team with Gary Swart, an experienced executive. Swart took over as chief executive officer, while Tsatalos and Karamanlakis continued to develop the technology. On the business side, the team immediately faced a problem. Their product allowed firms to manage contractors in distant places, but firms didn't yet have contractors in distant places. They only had contractors in their local areas. For any project, there might well have been a candidate somewhere in the world who could do the job better and charge less than a local contractor. The contractor could still be in an Indian megacity, in Kenya's budding Silicon Savannah, in one of Eastern Europe's post-Soviet technical universities, or even in the US Midwest. A firm in Silicon Valley, where the costs were now sky high, or in Berlin's Silicon Alley, or in London's Silicon Roundabout, could benefit greatly from finding that candidate and hiring them remotely. But in practice, there was no easy way for the parties to find each other. In microeconomic terms, the problem was that of search costs. Pinpointing the right candidate from the haystack of the world's labor pool required lots of effort. The internet had lowered search costs to a certain extent. A firm looking for a remote contractor could post a job advertisement online and receive resumes by email. But evaluating foreign candidates' qualifications remained just as difficult as before. What skills does this person have? Are these references from reputable firms? Is this degree from a good university? How do I even know if this degree is real? Each country has its own institutions and cultures of evidencing competence. Contractors had similar questions about prospective clients and their credentials. So for both parties, local prospects remained much easier to read. And as a result, despite whatever voltage potentials might have existed in terms of labor prices and skills, search costs tended to make distant labor contracts uneconomical to pursue. To overcome the tyranny of distance, it was therefore not enough to solve the agent principal problem. The search cost problem also needed to be addressed somehow. Now, Tsatalos and Karamanlakis started looking for a technical solution to the search cost problem. They built a website on which contractors could browse jobs posted by clients and apply to work on them. Clients could browse contractor profiles and invite them to apply. They called it an online talent marketplace, a sort of eBay for freelancing. eBay was very successful at the time, the darling of Silicon Valley, and everyone wanted to build eBay for this and eBay for that. And unlike a conventional job board, the site displayed lots of standardized information about the clients, and especially about the contractors. In particular, it displayed information that wasn't self-reported by the users themselves, like in a conventional job application, but by other users or by the system itself as it observed and surveilled the users. For example, the profile of a contractor named Gonzalo indicated that he was a PHP developer, a full stack developer based in Portugal. The profile was adorned with tags for skills such as PHP, MySQL, and system administration, and indicated that his standard rate was $57 per hour. The profile also presented results from computer-administered skill tests that Gonzalo had taken on the platform. He had obtained a full 5.00 grade from the PHP, MySQL, and Unix tests. And according to the platform, this placed him in the top 10% of test takers. His English grade was 3.75, placing him in the top 30%. Instead of references from past employers, like in a conventional labor market, the profile displayed information on past projects carried out through the platform. One of Gonzalo's latest projects was titled Bug Fix Web App and Add Features, for which he had charged 506 hours and earned a full 5-star rating. Another project had been somewhat less successful, earning him only 3.5 stars, and the following note: he can do the job, speaks good English, is intelligent, but is often late. The platform also displayed the total number of projects that Gonzalo had completed, the total amount of money that he had earned, and various other statistics about his experience and track record, which was very impressive. These bits of information reduced search costs in two ways. First, because they were collected in a standardized format, they could be used to perform rapid automatic searches. For instance, a client could ask the platform to list all full stack developers with an hourly rate between $30 and $60 who were fluent in English. And second, and perhaps most important, clients could place a fairly high degree of trust in the information, because it wasn't just self-reported bragging. As one contractor whom we interviewed explained, you may say, I attended Harvard, I have this, I have that. Nobody's going to pay you based on that. While your skills are very important and all that, the validation comes from the client feedback. Through statistical analysis of transaction records, my colleagues and I found that clients did indeed pay higher rates to contractors who had completed more skill tests, obtained better feedback, and amassed longer track records. A 1 standard deviation increase in the number of skill tests completed was associated with a 3% increase in the contractor's hourly pay. And 1 standard deviation increase in the contractor's average reputation rating, which corresponded to about 3/4 of a star on a 5-star scale, was associated with 7% more pay. And the 1 standard deviation increase in the contractor's project experience meant 19% more pay. And many contractors' experiences accorded with these findings. One said that I ask for more money now than I asked for 5 years ago. I have more experience and many good feedbacks, and clients can trust me on projects. Another said that I effectively choose how much I get paid now. I have got to that level where I have sufficient experience and sufficient feedback to set my own rates. We also found that university degrees and other formal and national qualifications that contractors mentioned on their profiles were not associated with any extra pay. This is not to say that education wasn't useful in remote contract work. On the contrary, we found that remote contractors were on average more highly educated than the general population was. But it appeared that in this transnational labor market, national qualifications, degree certificates, were not a very effective way of evidencing the skills that education provides. So instead, workers and employers relied on these digital qualifications developed by Tsatalos and Karamanlakis as evidence of skills and competence. So with this talent marketplace set up to overcome search costs. Odesk's cloud labor market was ready to take off. The CEO, Swart, launched marketing campaigns. Contractors started signing up, first in the thousands, then in the tens of thousands, and then in the hundreds of thousands. And in February 2012, the company announced that it had signed up a total of 1.6 million contractors. The great majority of contracts, approximately 90%, took place between a client and a worker based in two different countries. So had knowledge work finally transcended national boundaries? Was the tyranny of distance overthrown? Well, Gradus, a 27-year-old remote contractor based in Nairobi, pictured here, said as follows: "It's much easier getting jobs when you're not from Kenya. It feels demoralizing that people think that you're unskilled if you're from the third world. Third world people are only offered low-skilled jobs." Now, Gradus spoke fluent English. He had studied actuarial science at a university, yet contracts that he felt qualified to do tended to go to Europeans, Americans, Australians. Even though the nationality of someone who wrote reports and performed calculations on a spreadsheet should not have mattered, it was starting to become apparent that clients on platforms like Odesk discriminated against contractors from lower income countries. This was ironic because it was precisely the lower income workers that in principle could have delivered the greatest savings to clients and gained the greatest improvements to their own livelihoods. Annika, a 36-year-old freelance writer based in Johannesburg, South Africa, explained, "There's the perception that the quality will not be as good, the English language skills will not be as good, and for some people that holds true. But for a lot of people on this continent, that's not true at all. We speak, read, and write excellent English." In practice, these prejudices meant that to win contracts from clients, workers like Gradus and Annika had to accept pay rates that were extremely low, even by the standards of their country's generally lower wage levels. This discrimination was, of course, not unique to remote freelance work. Migrant workers, agricultural producers, even manufacturing firms from lower income countries all had to battle negative country stereotypes when entering global markets. So perhaps even a digital online labor market could not hope to transcend discrimination based on race and geographic origin. But as time passed, something interesting began to happen. Workers from both rich and poor countries obtained higher rates as their experience grew. But for workers in poor countries, this effect was in some cases noticeably faster. For instance, an average graphic designer in the United States earned about $20 per hour, but one standard deviation's worth of additional project experience was associated with an increase of only 0.1% in their pay rate. Designers in the Philippines earned much less to begin with, about $9 per hour, but their gain from additional experience was over 5%. Indian designers earned about $9 per hour, but gained over 8% from additional experience. So as a result, the more experience these workers racked up, the narrower became their pay gap with workers from rich countries. Some contractors have noticed this. An audio transcriber in Manila, Philippines, said, "Once you do get those first few projects and you get good feedback for that, then it doesn't really matter anymore that you're from the Philippines." A software developer in Lagos, Nigeria, agreed. He said, I had almost 250 jobs and all of them were 5 stars. Most of the time when I send invitations, the clients say, hey, I see your profile and I see that you're a very good programmer. Can you help me with this? They don't say, hey, I see your profile, you're a Nigerian. Some of the discrimination that workers from lower income countries experience thus appear to have been what economists call statistical discrimination. Employers hesitated to pay these workers the full rate, not necessarily because of any deep-seated hatred or animosity, but because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that untested workers from such countries would on average be less competent than their North American and European peers. But once hard evidence of the workers' competence started to pile up, then employers' behaviors changed as they could see for themselves that the workers were in fact highly competent. American and European workers' rates didn't improve nearly as much since employers were assuming them to be more competent to begin with. And this way, the platform's digital qualifications or the reputation system and skill tests and measures of experience help knowledge workers from some of the world's more marginalized regions to overcome some of the prejudices that they had faced and win more contracts at better rates. Now, Odesk's success was mirrored by other online labor platforms with names like People Per Hour, Prolance, Guru.com, and vWorker. Most of these platforms lacked Odesk's sophisticated monitoring and collaboration tools, but they had built up markets around specific types of contracts and specific clients and other niches. This initial proliferation of online labor platforms was followed by a period of consolidation. Many of the smaller sites were bought up by freelancer.com, a venture capital-backed platform based in Sydney, Australia. Odesk itself merged with its major competitor, Elance, and in 2015, the combined platform was rebranded as Upwork. In 2016, most of this new global online labor market was underpinned by just a handful of English language platforms. Now, the largest occupational category in this new global online labor market was and still is software development and technology, which accounted for over 40% of projects in the market. Most of the demand for these services came from higher labor cost countries. The United States alone accounted for almost 40% of the demand, while European employers together accounted for just under 30%. But most of the labor supply came from workers in lower income countries. So over 50% of the workers were based in the Indian subcontinent. Only in the professional services category did workers from the United States and United Kingdom hold the greatest market shares. So most of these workers were located in countries that were already major destinations in conventional IT and business process outsourcing. Countries like India and the Philippines were multinational corporations that established back offices and call centers and so on. These back office workers found that platforms allowed them to do similar work as independent contractors, essentially trading job security for the potential flexibility and higher earnings of freelance work. A data entry keyer in the Philippines said that the jobs that we're being asked to do on a platform are most probably the same as what we're doing in the office. But many of the workers also lived in remoter regions, in places where the outsourcing companies had never set foot. If these people possessed valuable skills and if they knew how to market themselves, platforms were in principle their gateway to the global economy. And for both kinds of workers, the online labor market presented an electrifying opportunity to work directly for clients in distant, wealthy countries, countries that many desired to travel to, but few ever could. So by 2017, Upwork boasted having 14 million registered workers based in 180 countries. The workers were earning over $1 billion per year through the platform, of which the platform took 10% as fees. But as more and more workers entered, competition started to put pressure on wages. Without the tyranny of distance, jobs on the platform flowed to wherever the costs were lowest. A Nigerian enterprise IT contractor lamented, "I'm no longer competing with Nigerians. I'm competing with people from all over the world. Somebody will bring the same quality for a lower pricing. He can afford to do it at that rock bottom price. I can't go lower." A Kenyan contractor felt the same. The competition is tough. In India, they offer very high quality work at a very cheap rate, extremely cheap. Sometimes I want to take a job, but I can't because there's someone who is bid a lower rate and will finish the work even faster. Commentators suggested that this virtual globalization would lead to a race to the bottom in wages. Indeed, some online labor platforms specialized in low-paid, de-skilled work. E-commerce giant Amazon launched a platform called Mechanical Turk in 2005 as a way to source remote piece workers for the company's own needs. A typical task was to label images to produce training data for an AI system. Pay rates, and thus Amazon's own labor costs, were permanently depressed by unbridled competition between workers around the world. But platforms like Odesk had rather different incentives. They earned all of their income from the payroll taxes paid by the workers and employers who populated the platform. Payroll taxes meaning fees paid to the platform here. A dirt poor, low-wage labor market yielded less tax income per capita. It also scared away the most skilled knowledge workers and the most lucrative clients who pursued those workers. So platform owners began to realize that the virtual globalization that they had unleashed on their digital domains had its downsides. Labor laws and regulations of the countries where the workers lived were of little use in moderating this virtual globalization, as they did not apply to independent contractors. And even if they had applied, rules such as minimum wages varied drastically between countries, and many countries had no statutory minimum wages at all. So Odesk's administration realized that if they wanted to create a high-skill, high-wage online economy, they would have to start regulating the labor market themselves. In August 2014, the company announced a policy update. Beginning November 15, 2014, we will introduce a minimum rate of $3 per hour for all new hourly contracts. Our vision is to be the world's largest, most trusted workplace known for top-notch talent and jobs. We believe that the new hourly minimum will benefit the entire community by setting an expectation of higher pay for higher quality work. Now, $3 was, of course, a very, very low bar. And indeed, the company said that only about 3% of workers at the time, that their earnings fell below that bar. But its significance was that it was a truly global minimum wage. For the first time in history, workers from New York to Nairobi and Mumbai to Manila were brought under the same mandatory minimum standard enforced by a single authority. Policy implementation was swift and effective. If users tried to insert a rate below $3 into a contract, they received an error message from the platform. Please enter a value between $3 and $899. The downsides of the minimum wage policy also became immediately apparent. I'm a stay-at-home mom badly in need of a job, but because of this decision, I'm unable to, wrote a worker in India on Odesk's community forum. How long will this test run? We are suffering from lack of job, wrote a virtual assistant in Bangladesh. So workers whose competitive advantage had been their extremely low hourly rate were now deprived of that edge. A data entry specialist in the Philippines argued that, in fact, work that paid below $3 had still been, quote, pretty good money, especially if it allows you to stay in your province and not have to move to the big city for a job and live in a boarding house. Still, many other workers welcomed the new policy, as did many clients. An experienced contractor in India wrote as follows: as a quality freelancer, I myself have faced a lot of competition. By setting minimum rates, Odesk has clearly sent a message. Thank you, Odesk. Economist John Horton measured the effects of Odesk's minimum wage policy. He found that average hourly wages on the market increased by as much as 10 to 15%, while the total number of hours worked on the platform diminished by about 6%. Employers dropped workers whom they had previously paid under $3 and switched instead to better paid workers who appeared to be more productive in that they accomplished the same work in less time. Odesk followed this minimum wage policy with many other policy measures, both soft and hard. As a soft measure, the platform started nudging workers into requesting higher wages when their skills and productivity seemed to justify it. The administration collected data on projects and pay rates and used it to provide guidance to the workers as they submitted their wage requests. Another policy measure was to advise workers on skill development. The administration started pushing a quarterly list of skills whose demand was growing in the online market, complete with links to relevant online courses. For instance, digital media and marketing strategies on Coursera, or deep learning with Python on edX. In segments where labor demand exceeded supply, the platform's administrators also used online advertising to attract more inbound workers. But for segments where labor supply already exceeded demand, the administration instituted a system of vetting new entrants. Quote, unfortunately, at this time, there are already many freelancers with a similar skill set to yours, and we cannot accept your application, said a message to those denied entry into the global market. On the whole, Odesk's and Upwork's labor market policies seemed fairly successful in managing wages. In some segments of the market, competition remained more intense than in others, resulting in very low wages. But across the entire market, average wages did not fall over time. They increased from about $11 in 2013 to about $18 in 2020. It was nothing like a high-wage labor market comparable to Silicon Valley or London, nothing like it. But at least the race to the bottom, which was unleashed by Odesk's elimination of borders and distances, had been stopped, and thousands of people enjoyed higher wages on the internet than they could have obtained in their local labor markets. Now, territorial forms of social organization, like nation states, are good at underpinning territorially bounded markets. But transactions that cross territorial boundaries are almost by definition, difficult for them to support. An independent knowledge worker in the Philippines cannot use national courts to recover fees left unpaid by a London-based client, even when it is possible legally, which is by no means always the case. It is almost certainly unviable economically. So strong is the link between national territories and market boundaries that in international business jargon, the word market is used to refer to countries. Tsatalos and Karamanlakis wanted to liberate workers from the confines of their local labor markets, to, quote, make remote work feel like, look like, be like local work, unquote. With clever mechanisms, they successfully helped thousands of workers and employers to find each other over distance and cooperate across national boundaries, and to some extent even overcome discrimination based on national origin. With active policymaking, their deterritorial administration also mitigated many of the effects of the ensuing global competition for jobs. I would argue that in the end, they achieved this not by eliminating the importance of location as such, but by substituting a kind of virtual location for physical territory. Just as rural workers previously had to journey to the city to meet employers, so knowledge workers now had to turn up at Odesk to find a client. Odesk and a handful of other platforms became the new nexus where supply and demand met. Said a digital marketing contractor in Los Angeles, you use them because you have to. No one has any other option. And if traditional references and degrees were most valuable in their national contexts, so knowledge workers' reputation ratings and other indicators of competence and quality were tied to the platform. On the platform, the worker had a profile that the administration and previous clients vouched for. Outside the platform, they were a stranger scarcely worth trusting. Quote, I was so close to deactivating my account, then I realized, oh no, all those good feedbacks are going to be deleted, said a programmer in Manila. And as countries had their courts and employment tribunals, so Odesk had a dispute resolution center in which administrators handled disputes taking place within their virtual jurisdiction. They could enforce payment of monies held in escrow, but only for work conducted through the platform. Many workers had stories of having been lured to conduct work outside the platform to save on fees, only to be cheated of pay. Indeed, so tough was it to make a living in the unincorporated internet outside of this virtual hiring town that many more people wanted to enter it than its administrators were ultimately willing to let in. Like many nation states, the platform began to admit only those deemed valuable to the economy and denied entry to the rest. Its initially open borders were replaced with the virtual equivalent of an immigration point system with visa numbers tightly controlled. The most desperate workers turned to buying Upwork identities like fake passports from the black market to smuggle themselves in. The Tsatalos and Karamanlakis ended up erecting virtual borders in place of physical ones illustrates how borders are not historical leftovers, but consequences of modernity. Pre-modern boundaries could be vague, as cooperation and search rested on informal norms and personal networks. But formal institutions like courts, regulations, and standards entail sharp distinctions between those within and those without. A person cannot be slightly subject or somewhat accredited. As platforms created digitalized versions of modern institutions, they ended up recreating borders as well. Now, European state borders were originally established along geographic features like rivers and mountain ranges that inhibited trade and offered natural security. As communication and transport links improved, geography became less significant in shaping interactions and institutional boundaries more significant. More recent state borders, such as those drawn by European colonizers in Africa, are more virtual in the sense that they are straight lines divorced from geographic and tribal realities and reflecting only institutional boundaries willed into being by the powers. The power borders of platforms today are entirely virtual, encompassing identities and affordances instead of bodies and soil, but more and more hinges on where exactly they fall, while the unincorporated internet between platform companies' domains grows increasingly narrow. So I hope that this story of Upwork's history and how, despite trying to overcome and in some ways succeeding in overcoming national boundaries, the founders were never able to overcome entirely the concept of boundaries in trying to manage a market on the internet. So my answer to the question of are we moving towards a borderless labor market is that we may be moving towards a labor market in which national boundaries are less important, but certainly insofar as we live with modern institutions, some kind of boundaries, exclusion and inclusion will remain central organizational concepts in the economy, I think. That's all I wanted to relate today. Thank you very much for your attention.